Officials fighting to save an American landmark turn to the most unlikely heroes for help.
Before we continue with the rest of the video, we could use your help. Click that like button to help spread the word about watchJojo, and also be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss our future videos.
Yellowstone National Park is one of those places you can describe in as much detail as possible, but your words won't even scratch the surface of the serene beauty sprawled out over a 3,500 square mile area. Hot springs, canyons, waterfalls, and lush vegetation are just a few of the delights it offers. And of course, who could forget about everyone's favorite geyser, Old Faithful? Yellowstone's incredible biodiversity wasn't always what it is today. In fact, there was a period of time when riverbeds were eroding, vegetation dwindled, and you couldn't spot anywhere near the array of species that live out there today. But one simple idea breathed life back into the entire park. Yellowstone National Park wasn't always as rich with animals and nature as it is today. It was never an unsightly spot to explore, of course, but in the 80s and early 90s, you really wouldn't have been awestruck by its beauty. Before 1926, Yellowstone National Park was full of wolves. They thrived in the park. But within the first few decades of the 1900s, government predator control programs wiped them out entirely. This was a problem. No one saw another wolf until 1977, about 50 years later. But even then, it was a lone wolf or two merely wandering through. Oddly, it was the lack of wolves that led to the park's decline. With no predators to fear, the deer population absolutely exploded. They could eat and overgraze all they wanted without worrying about wolves. Soon, the forests and meadows were barren, but the deer and their ilk kept at it. As the deer kept grazing, taking all the resources for themselves, the other animals suffered. Creatures that dined on fauna stood no chance in the food race against deer. Animals that ate those animals saw their food supply dwindle. And the rapid loss of vegetation didn't just leave the forest bare. Without vegetation keeping soil in place, the rivers that ran through Yellowstone began eroding, which prompted the loss of many animal species who relied on healthy waters to survive. Yellowstone was struggling, and park employees needed to find a solution. It really all boiled down to the high numbers of deer, they knew, so in 1995 they hatched a plan. The deer needed predators, plain and simple, and workers figured this would be the perfect time to reintroduce wolves back into Yellowstone. Packs of gray wolves were released into the park, and hopeful employees prayed it was the answer. Now the deer were suddenly thrust back into the predator versus prey world, and even though there were far fewer wolves than deer, the wolves were fearsome hunters. They welcomed the challenge. Day and night the battle ensued, and the wolves were the victors nearly every time. This relationship between the wolves and deer is known as top-down control. Top-down control is when predators who sit atop the food chain assist with the regulation of the animals who are beneath them. That's exactly what happened when the wolves were reintroduced. With deer numbers dwindling, the vegetation flourished. Aspen and willow trees that hadn't seen a successful life for decades finally grew back tenfold, and it seemed they were healthier than ever. But the trees were just the very beginning of the massive change. The waterways running through the parks began changing, and the regenerated vegetation growing on the riverbeds brought with it a whole new array of life not seen in such a long time. For the first time in forever, beavers returned to the water. They began constructing their intricate dams, which contributed to a habitat that attracted a variety of reptiles, otters, and muskrats. Because of the increased vegetation, mice and rabbits thrived, which in turn gave the red fox an amazing feasting opportunity. Red fox numbers grew, and still there was even more happening. The number of bears also increased. The deer had scoured bushes and ate the same berries the bears had enjoyed. But with the berries now finally plentiful again, the bears could eat without a problem. Through it all, the wolves gained a feathery friend. Ravens are known to follow behind wolves and pick at the remains of whatever they hunt and kill. The four-legged assassins were hard at work, and those ravens were always close behind. The new lush vegetation not only benefited all the animals, but it helped drastically slow down and sometimes completely stop the erosion of riverbeds. The changes were nothing short of miraculous. Incredibly, the wolves, although nowhere near as abundant in numbers as the deer, managed to not only change the ecosystem, but the physical geography of Yellowstone National Park. It was a feat that had every park employee and wolf howling with joyous pride. What's most shocking about this development was how few wolves it took to really change Yellowstone for the better. Still, this reflects a human truth. It only takes a handful of people to make a huge difference. For instance, the Indian island of Majoli, located within the Brahmaputra river system in northeast India, boasted over 140 villages and over 150,000 people. Like Yellowstone, the island was in trouble. See, Majoli is actually the world's largest river island. These special islands are really just big sandbars that form throughout a riverbed. Sometimes the sandbars are so large people can actually live on them, and that's the case with Majoli. But in the heat of a river's current, the island changes shape and size frequently, which poses a threat to its inhabitants. In fact, over the last 70 years, the island has shrunk by more than half its original size. Why the change? Because during the monsoon season, large embankments were built up the river to protect larger towns from flooding. This didn't allow the riverbanks to naturally flood, and therefore directed all excess water towards Majoli. As the river water eroded the island, space for the 150,000 inhabitants shrank. Since 1991, over 35 villages were washed away, forcing villagers to leave the only home they ever knew. Indian authorities are concerned that within the next 20 years, the entire island of Majoli will be completely submerged, and the 140 villages left will be lost forever. If they don't do something about it now, their fears will become a reality. The people aren't the only ones being affected either. Animals are being severely affected by the intense flooding, resulting in major casualties. In fact, the snake population alone has dropped by 45% in just the last 5 years. When the river flooded the island, it would pick up the snakes and carry them downstream. The water dumped the snakes onto treeless sandbars surrounding Majoli, leaving them exposed to the excessive heat and the harsh Indian sun. One man in particular, Jadav Payeng from the Mising tribe of Majoli, grew up watching the island shrink. He watched villages wash away. He watched animals torn from their homes, and he watched the villagers grow more and more concerned. As the young boy, Jadav loved nature, animals, even the snakes, and anything that grew. This impacted him from a very young age and sparked his interest in environmental activism and forestry conservation. He was determined to save the island, and not just himself, but for his family and tribe. So at the age of 16, he decided to dedicate his life to do just that, saving Majoli. How he did it was no small feat. One day in 1979, he started planting trees. He managed to get seeds and made his way to a large barren area on Majoli. He dug a small hole using a stick, dropped them in the hole, and left the rest to nature. He knew that planting one tree wouldn't do much of anything, so day after day he returned and planted as many trees as he possibly could. His hope was that the trees would grow tall with deep roots, and they would hold the earth in place and protect the island from erosion. After 40 years of consistent work, he'd planted an entire forest on the island, over tens of thousands of trees. This work resulted in a forest that was far larger than the size of New York Central Park. The forest was rightfully dubbed Malai Forest. He said that planting trees became much easier once he could seed from the trees that already existed in the forest. Still, Jadav faced struggles each day. With his forest continually growing, animals returned to the area. Elephants, Bengal tigers, and rhinos, to name a few, now call this area of Majoli home. With the return of animals, Jadav said poachers became a problem once more. Jadav said, all species on this planet are animals, including humans. There's no monsters in nature except for humans. Humans consume everything until there's nothing left. In 2015, he was awarded the Padma Shri, the fourth highest civilian honor in India. Additionally, he was recognized by many other local Indian establishments for dedicating his life to the conservation of Majoli. Still, Jadav was frustrated by the lack of real help he'd received. He suggested planting coconut trees because they're strong and straight, which would help anchor the soil. And coconut harvesting would boost the economy, all within 5 years. But sadly, no one adopted his proposal. Jadav refused to give up. He had dreams of seeing Majoli return to the lush green forest it once was before humans so drastically altered it. He believed that he could save the island of Majoli. He stated, "I will continue to plant until my last breath." It takes a certain level of self-control to channel desperation into something positive. Yet in the Indian state of Maharashtra, that's precisely what Bapuru Tanish set out to do after his wife was embarrassed by a group of upper caste elites. Like many societies across the world, India still operates on a caste system, and those in the upper levels hold a lot of power over those below them. This system has oppressed the less fortunate for countless generations. The upper caste wield so much power that when Baprao's wife kneeled beside a well to fetch water for her thirsty family, the elites in the area did more than just refuse her. They also ridiculed and humiliated her.